Okay, so now that we've seen how closures work and how most of our apps are essentially event-driven, i.e. messages being sent around in order to trigger the next action, then we're at a place where we're ready to talk about completion handlers. So at the moment, we can only see our client-side code, i.e. this create user method is created by Firebase, and we're simply using it or calling it, in this case, passing in the necessary parameters. So in order to show you both sides, let's create two classes. Let's pretend that we're creating the Firebase class, and we've also got our own class. Let's call it my app. So we know that the Firebase class has a method called createUser, and it takes a few parameters, namely the username, which is a string, and the password, which is also a string. And then inside this createUser method, it does some funky stuff. It networks with Google's web servers and registers our user in our Firebase database. So we don't need to know the specifics of how it does that, but all we need to know is that it does something quite time-consuming. So we have to wait for that process to complete. So when we're calling that method, say that we have a method called register button press, then we can create a reference to that Firebase. Let Firebase equal Firebase, create a new object, and then we're going to tap into the method create user, and we're going to give it a username, and the password was 12345. Now, the problem here is that this method will take some time, and we don't want the user interface to freeze up while that's happening. So cleverly, Firebase makes their methods happen in the background, so it doesn't block up our app. But before we can move on in our registration, i.e. for example, taking the user to the chat screen, we have to wait for this process to complete and be successful. So that means we need a way to be notified once this background process completes. So it's going to do something time consuming, but once that's done, we want it to send a message back to the method that called it and says the process is complete, it was either successful or not successful, and here's the user ID that I created. So in order to do this, we need a completion handler. So what does that mean? If our createUser method accepted a function as one of the parameters, then we can call that function once our time-consuming process has completed. So let me show you what this will look like. So inside my app, I'm going to create a method called completed, and it's going to take two parameters, and one of them is called isSuccess, and it's going to be a Boolean, i.e. either true or false. And the other thing that it's going to send back is a user ID, because when we create a new entry in a database, we should get an ID for that item in the database that uniquely identifies it. So user ID, and that's going to be an integer. And this method returns nothing, so it doesn't have an output. So we can go ahead and add that function as a parameter, and the parameter name is going to be called completion. And the data type of this completion parameter is going to be a function. So remember, we're going to boil down this function to all of its data types. So it's a Boolean, so it takes two parameters, a Boolean and an integer, and it returns nothing, or it returns void. So if we didn't add this return part, then the compiler will think that the data type of this third parameter is two data types, or what we would call in programming a tuple. But instead, we actually want to tell it that we want to pass in a function, and we're going to show that by using the return void. So now this createUser method takes three parameters. Firstly, the username, the password, and also a function is going to be passed in as an input parameter as well. And that function is, of course, this completed function. Now, when that function gets passed in, we can use it inside the body of this function. So we can refer to that function by using the parameter name. So just as we can refer to these variables, username and password, we can also refer to the method parameter by using completion. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this method completion once the time-consuming thing is done. And we're going to pass in two variables. Now those variables will probably get created when we're creating the user. So it will be a variable called isSuccess, and that is set to true. So let's say in this case it was successful. And we can have another variable called user ID, which gets generated when we add a new entry to our Firebase database. So let's say our user ID in this case is 123. So now we can pass in these variables to this function that has the parameter name completion. And so we can put isSuccess in here, and we can put user ID in here. So now essentially what happens in this create user method is that it does something time consuming in order to register our user and put a new entry into our Firebase database. And this of course happens in the background. And once that process is complete, it's going to call this function that is held inside this completion parameter. And it's going to pass in these variables. So then this method receives those two items as input parameters, and we can now use it inside this other class. So for example, we can say print registration is successful, and then we put the success parameter in here. So it will be registration is successful, true, or registration is successful, false. And the other thing that we can print is we can print the user ID. So user ID is, and then we insert the user ID string in here, and then we print out both of these input parameters. So now the only error that we've got is here, where it says that create user actually takes 3 parameters. And of course, the third parameter for completion has not been added. So let's go ahead and call this method again so we can see how it looks now. And if you type enter, you can see that create user takes 3 input parameters. The username, which we'll again give it as Angela, the password 123456, and the final parameter that's called completion takes a function that has 2 input parameters, 1 Boolean, 1 integer, and returns nothing. So that is of course our completed function. So I'm going to pass in the completed function in here. And now if we test it out, let's go ahead and create a object from my app. So my app equals my app. And then inside my app, I'm going to call the method register button pressed. So now what happens is that we trigger this method register button pressed, and we create a new Firebase object, and we tap into that object's create user method, passing in a username, a password, and also a function that goes under the parameter completion. So then that function goes in over here, and once the time-consuming thing is done, once our user creation process is complete, then we call that function by referring to it by its parameter name, and then we pass in the data that we obtained through creating that user. So whether if it was successful and the user ID that was generated. Then this method call gets completed over here, and these parameters, these bits of data, now get passed in over here, and we're able to print them in 2 print statements, and you can see them show up over here. So the registration is successful is true, and the user ID is 123. So essentially, we have built a completion handler so that we can show you both sides of the coin. Now, of course, in our Flash Chat app, we're only seeing this part of the process. And if you look back over here, you can see that completion handler actually looks a little bit different from what we've got. It's got a closure in there instead of passing in the function name. So let's use our knowledge of closures to change this into the same format. Let's make this take a closure as an input argument. So remember, the way that we convert a function to a closure is we first delete the func keyword and the name of the function, Next, we move this opening brace to the beginning of the closure and we replace it instead with the in keyword. So now if we copy all of this and instead of calling the completed function, we simply insert this closure, then everything still works as expected and our syntax now looks very, very similar to what we've got here. So here we're calling the create user method. We're giving in a email, we're giving it a password, and we're also triggering this completion handler block using a closure. And inside this closure, we're going to be passed back two items. One is the user details, and the other is an error if there was an error. So then we check if there was an error, in which case we should print the error. Otherwise, we're going to take our user to the chat view controller. So this closure only gets triggered once the process of creating users gets completed in the Firebase authentication class. So essentially we have a process that's happening in the background, namely creating the user. Once that process is completed, we get a callback in the form of a completion handler, and then we deal with that callback by taking our user to the chat view controller. So that means that our app isn't frozen, isn't blocked up while that networking or while that user creation part happens. And only once it completes do we get a message and we trigger the next stage. So this in essence is how completion handlers work. This closure gets passed in as an input parameter to this create user method. And that closure only gets called once everything gets completed. So you might realize that up till now we've actually seen this format in quite a few places. For example, when we called our APIs, it has to do something in the background, namely it has to fetch the weather data or it has to fetch the Bitcoin data. And only once that's complete do we get a callback message and we get our closure being executed.